once upon a time on Earth. Right in the middle of skyscrapers, a tree engulfed in a golden glow took root, and in the blink of an eye, it grew and engulfed everything. And then it created a new world based on different game genres. Each part of it was unique, unlike the others. Thanks to the tree, a labyrinth was created, which was inhabited by various magical creatures, nature and castles. But people called it the game of God. And those who entered the world became players, the elite of society. Not everyone was given the opportunity to visit the labyrinth. A dirty boy in a threadbare sweatshirt was hugged by his grandfather by the shoulder and praised for his work. But he didn't even react. He handed him a small data transmitter on a dirty work glove, explaining along the way that even though it had fake data, it was still valuable. But he didn't say a word, roughly pushing away his grandfather's hand, on whose face a surprised, indignant expression immediately appeared. Walking through the dirty streets, he no longer noticed the sick, dirty and hungry people who were groaning, leaning against the smoke-stained brick walls. His path led to the place where he spent all his time after work until the money ran out, to the random box store. In the store, there was the usual hubbub of angry shouts, pleas to the machines and requests to borrow more money. For the umpteenth time, he sat down on a chair in front of the machine of random boxes. This legal gambling game had sucked in the whole world of unknowns. Sighing heavily, the guy stared at the ghostly screen, beckoning him to spin a 10. The main prize was again the opportunity to create his own account. A box with a blue tail flashed from the depths of the starry sky of the machine gun. It swung open, revealing to a tired gaze the simplest toothbrush that he had seen countless times, sending her to the pile of useless things that fell to him. Everything from toilet brushes to car tires. The box sparkled with a bright, subtle flourish. Unfortunately, it was still just a rare rank. With an indifferent face, without even looking at some jar, he sent her to that mountain of things. Suddenly, the machine gun sparkled with starlight and shone with all the colors of the rainbow, and sparks sprayed out of it straight out. The drowsiness immediately subsided from him. His eyes widened, and his hands trembled when he saw what had befallen him. A black card with a golden frame of some curls shone with starlight in the finely trembling fingers. There is only one way to access the maze. This is to create an account and use the game account avatar. Rushing headlong to the exit, he saw nothing of his happiness. He was in such a hurry to register his account in the central zone that he did not notice the bat flying in his face. From the blow, he fell to the ground. His head immediately began to buzz, and hot blood flowed down his forehead. A group of some guys towered over him, grinning. They laughed at his appearance, while rummaging through his pockets. The man who is their boss snatched the card, showing his true face. Even his voice changed as he talked about how much he wanted to get it. While still conscious, he extended his hand to him, weakly asking him to give it back, but received a kick right in the face. The man bent down towards him, grabbed him by the hair, and lifted his bloody face towards himself, grinning right into his eyes. Pointing his finger at his forehead, the thug activated the window, which contained an agreement to purchase a card for 30,000 points. And the bandit again pulled him up to slam his head into the asphalt. Blood sprayed out of him with renewed vigor. It seemed that after this, he would not get up. However, breathing heavily and not paying attention to the noise in his head, he got up at the thought of this card. The bandits turned around, thinking that he was going to take the card, and cracked their fingers, preparing their bats. But the guy, clearly not seeing anything in front of him, with a very unsteady gait, barely moving his legs, walked past them to the machine guns. Heavy breathing escaped his chest with whistling and wheezing. His eyes were clouded with a film of tears and rain. He held on to sheer willpower, leaving a wet, bloody trail behind him. He walked unhindered to the machine. People even walked away themselves, watching him in shock. His legs gave way and his body fell onto the tiled floor. He couldn't even raise his arms, but the machine gun was so close. Using the remnants of strength that came from somewhere in him, the guy pulled himself up and opened his eyes, lightly poking the blue button with his finger. Suddenly, streams of blinding light enveloped him, lifting him into the air. But the young man no longer saw this. His consciousness went out from his injuries. A second, and he stands behind the podium as a defendant, and a spotlight shines right on him from the darkness. And the thought immediately flashed through his head, what kind of place this is. Next, the guy discovered that his hands were handcuffed, and a voice coming out of nowhere read him an accusation that he had disclosed confidential company information. The guy wanted to shout that it wasn't him and didn't do anything like that, but he couldn't say anything. Suddenly, everything changed before his eyes again, and the guy looked around, not understanding where he had ended up. Everything looked as if he had died. A small robot appeared out of nowhere, demanding a name to create a game character. The guy screamed and immediately sat down, asking what kind of flying robot vacuum cleaner it was. He blinked his electronic eyes and said in an offended mechanical voice that he was a system of random boxes named Max. The guy reached out to him in surprise and asked if registration requires an avatar created using a game account. While Max was dumbfounded by the fact that he had a rank that no one knew before, a registration window appeared in front of him. Suddenly, everything turned white, and the guy had to cover his eyes in surprise, and the robot's electronic voice announced that they were going into a labyrinth. What he saw in the next second plunged him into shock. An area of unprecedented beauty with mountains, a clear sky, and a lake stretched out in front of him. He didn't even have time to enjoy the view when he caught strange knocking and clanking sounds. Turning around, he saw a whole crowd of skeletons with swords and shields. He was lucky enough to dodge the attack of one of them, and he gave in, knowing full well that with his bare hands he would become an easy prey. While he was fleeing, Max flew after him, screaming that this was too shameful, and the master was upsetting him. But he shouted that he didn't even have a weapon, to which the robot suggested simply opening the box, from which at least something useful should fall out, because he is not an ordinary player, which means he does not have access to what is available to players. A window with random boxes lit up in front of him as he ran, trying not to slow down too much. Rick didn't even notice what fell into his hands, but it felt like a stick, so he immediately turned towards the monsters, preparing to fight back. However, it turned out to be an ordinary toilet brush, which the skeleton immediately cut with his sword. Continuing to receive boxes, the guy did not notice the unevenness on the ground, and his foot fell down somewhere. The guy rolled head over heels to the tree, pressing his back into it, and watched in horror as a skeleton in a wig approached him with a sword. Nearby, Rick again dropped a blue box, from which a rare short sword appeared, as if ordered. Grinning with relief, he placed it under his opponent's sword, not allowing himself to be hurt. This helped for a short time. After all, handling the sword required skills that he did not have, so he was wounded in the shoulder. Nearby, in a lifeless voice, Max added that his master cannot use the system. Therefore, the health system is no exception. Jumping back, he saw the skeleton swinging and thought that he should not miss this once-in-a-lifetime chance. Suddenly, a golden box fell somewhere nearby, and Rick, without expecting it, parried the monster's blow, throwing it back. To his surprise, it was not one, but two boxes, each containing a skill that couldn't exist in a fantasy world. Having activated both new skills, he easily, as if he had done this for the 1,000th time, cut the skeleton vertically in half. Suddenly, he turned back to Max's voice, who was shouting something about an amazingly lucky owner, and couldn't believe his eyes. On the ground, emitting rainbow light in all directions, there stood a box that one could only dream of. While he was contemplating his luck, he was attacked from behind by 3 skeletons at once, their jaws clattering terribly. In 1 second, Rick cut them down with a long sword strike that cut through their swords and bones in a clean stripe. The corporation that gave people a world of fantasy was known to everyone in this world, especially the players who fought with each other for the first place in the ranking. Breathing heavily, he wiped the flowing sweat with his hand. The entire area around him was littered with swords and severed bones. Studying the control panel with the help of Max, it turned out that experience increase points are not converted into levels, but into points from random boxes. Burning with enthusiasm to earn even more points as quickly as possible, Rick wondered aloud how best to go on the road. Taking a detour, he came across a crowd of skeletons, menacingly knocking their bones, protruding from under the dark canopy of trees. At the same time, they rushed at each other, and Rick no longer doubted his abilities. Now he had the skills with which he could resist them. The clearing was rocked by a huge explosion, and flames shot up in clouds above the trees. This time, not a bit injured, Rick looked at the screen with the results of the journey, at the same time realizing that time in the maze was passing 10 times faster. Jumping out like a jack-in-the-box, Max spun around next to him, demanding to play him random boxes. However, Rick did not agree, and to the sad humming sounds of the robot, simulating crying, he sent all the experience points to leveling up his skills. He headed deeper into the forest, thinking that he should use this area as much as possible in order to level up. Having cut off the head of another skeleton, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and thought that it was time to finally raise the level. These bones were already fed up. Having checked his skills, he was convinced that he had reached the maximum level in them, and now it was wiser to spend points on random boxes. And besides, there were quite a few tickets accumulated. Max began to vibrate with pleasure, shouting joyfully again, and pressed himself against the master's cheek, like a pet. Gacha pleased him with a golden, very rare box, which, like heavenly Mona, fell at his feet. A dreamy expression of complete satisfaction appeared on the guy's face. Of course, this was not surprising, with such luck. The black and red sword pistol made him look so cool that the guy became enthusiastic again. With one swing of his sword, he could now cut wood perfectly evenly and at any angle. Such a possibility was amazing. When asked what would happen to the body in reality if he died here, widened eyes appeared on Max's screen, and the robot warned that it would be very painful. However, Rick just laughed, asking if that was all. But then he himself assured that everything was fine until he actually died. He also sent the remaining tickets into boxes, after which he received excellent leather armor for beginners, safe and durable. Once again plunging under the shade of the trees, he gave the order to Max to record all his adventures and post them on video on the platform. Rick was in just a great mood, so he calmly talked about the games that the tree creates and which games the gaming company creates. Entering the open area, he immediately encountered a huge 3-meter-tall knight in black armor, from which a very ominous aura emanated. Grinning boldly at the unexpected mission, he held his sword in front of him, announcing the start of the experiment. The knight's first blow hit the sword, with which Rick successfully parried the attack. It was hard to fight a strong boss after a crowd of weak ones, but the guy survived, having time to think that a successful parry would cover the difference in strength. But things didn't go beyond simple defense. Time after time, the enemy threw him back. His attacks didn't work, although the system had no effect on Rick. A sudden realization that he wouldn't break through the defense. While he was dodging the next attack, Max's voice was heard nearby, praising him for his excellent guess. A surprised expression appeared on the so-called robot's face, and he asked if the master was an idiot, after which he asked a question, after which one could consider himself one. While Rick was kicking himself for getting caught up in strategy without thinking about the knight's metal armor, he made another swing with his sword, fighting off the deadly blows, which became heavier. He urgently thought through what weak points the knight had, jumping higher and holding his sword at the ready. He raked his eyes over the black, seemingly impenetrable armor. His sword slid through the joint between the pieces of armor, piercing the boss's body. And at that moment, Rick pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, followed by a loud, fiery explosion that had to do something. The knight's hand flew somewhere far away. The body swayed from the loss of a limb, and the boss grabbed his shoulder. Having managed to rejoice and relax, Rick did not even notice how a black spike of energy pierced his shoulder. A severed hand emitting dark impulses attacked him. Because of this, he missed the following blue-black ropes, which rushed towards him like poisonous snakes. His reflexes did not fail him, and Rick managed to jump away at the last second, which is why the spikes, by inertia, stuck into the place where he was standing. With quick, short swings of his sword, he parried their attacks, but a desperate thought already appeared in his head that he could not cope. From fatigue, irritation, and lack of skill, he missed a blow straight to the stomach, the pain from which deprived him of his vision for a couple of seconds. A young dark-haired guy in a robe slammed his palm on the table, shouting indignantly why his strategic plan was rejected again. The man sitting at the table in front of him pulled out the papers again, asking if Raphael had already rejected him, to which the guy shouted that the plan had been finalized. Casually tossing him an envelope, the man with a sigh asked him to redo it, and not to download his license here, as if he were a player. The impact of a fist on the table rang out into the room, not so loudly, but quite noticeably to the body. Sitting at his desk, he gave vent to his emotions, clenching his fists and jaw with all his strength so as not to scream from the anger that overwhelmed him. Suddenly, a girl crept up from behind, frightening him with her sudden appearance. Apologizing for this, she handed him the coffee, explaining with a smile that he looked so tired that he wanted to cheer himself up. Leaning over, she stared into his blue eyes, getting so close that Rick blushed with embarrassment, and she herself offered to help with the guidance. Pointing his finger at the piece of paper, he said, embarrassed, that the last part was top secret, so she would have to ask permission from her superiors. After work, he ran to the hospital and, holding his mother's hand, rejoiced her that the date for the operation had finally been set and the money problem had been solved. The woman had tears in her eyes, and, hugging her son, she was sincerely happy that everything was getting better. Rick's eyes filled with horror when he heard the charges brought against him. The disclosure of top secret guild information. The guild council was not even going to listen to him, because Cynthia provided them with all the evidence. Lounging on an armchair like a king, Raphael looked at him for the first time, saying that it was always interesting for him to look at such a mug writing stupid plans. But Rick, it seemed, no longer heard his words. Clenching his hands so that his nails scratched the delicate skin, he could not believe Cynthia's betrayal. Throwing his hand around the girl's neck, Raphael asked her why she was communicating with such a brat, and invited her to go have a drink somewhere. Squeezing Rick's shoulder with his hand, he walked past him, saying that he was aware of his conversations about him, and finally said that he would go to celebrate the end of his life. The knight, who continued to press with his attack, boomed in surprise when he saw what was happening. Rick grabbed the thorn that had pierced him with one hand and tried to pull it out. Without waiting until the guy had enough time to fulfill his plan, the knight swung his sword, ending up next to the guy. At the last second, Rick tore a thorn from his stomach. Strength, rage, and hatred intertwined within him, turning off his pain receptors. Ignoring the splashing blood and the energy ropes wounding him, he grabbed the knight's horned head, raising his sword. He jumped straight at him, knocking him to the ground and plunging his sword into the knight. Losing any remaining fear, his whole body was beating with a grim determination to prove to everyone what he was capable of. The blade went straight into the eye socket. The warrior twitched for the last time and exhaled right in his face so that he would not give up under any circumstances. Rick fell to one knee over the disappearing knight and, exhaling heavily, said that even without his words, he would have continued to move forward. On a computer monitor in a dim room, a video was turned on of an unknown guy defeating a knight. The young, well-groomed man, with a casual gesture, pulled down his jacket and asked how long ago the video was posted, adding that he was well aware of his personality. All the guild analysts gathered in the conference room, looking with all their eyes at all the details of the video, from the guy's equipment and his personality to tactics. She turned to the boss, realizing that her knowledge was not enough to understand this video, screaming that they urgently needed to contact this guy. Surrounded by women, Raphael searched the eyes of the newcomer with a drunken look, asking who Rick was, and with a sigh, he reminded him who he was. The man hovered over him, reminding him that it was at his request that a good analyst was fired, to which Raphael only waved him off. But he did not lag behind, asking if he understood what it meant to fire that guy. But the player only turned to him irritably, asking why he should care about the garbage. Once outside, he was finally able to breathe fresh air. The assistant next to him asked what he was going to do. Max's electronic voice announced that the body's physical recovery had reached 87%, and rest was recommended for the body. Rick, leaning against the tree, groaned that the pain was so unbearable that he wanted to die. Max only issued a new report on this matter. After several painful steps, he was finally able to straighten up to see a new area that was no worse than a training area. Somewhere in the distance, half hidden by the mountains, surrounded by the setting sun, towered the tower of the demonic god. Already walking more confidently on the ground dried by the scorching sun, Rick talked with the robot, explaining to him why he started this dangerous game with video. His thoughts, returning to Raphael, suddenly crawled onto his face, sharpening and hardening him beyond recognition. It is not surprising, because these were thoughts of murder. The robot, which could not discern the master's emotions, was already chattering about the need to brighten up the time by knocking out random boxes, because there were quite enough tickets. However, Rick ignored him, asking what was happening to his body in this and the real world, while Max opened before him confirmation of the body conversion. The next second after confirmation, the guy was transported to the place where he passed out. Near the slot machines, only the robot was also nearby. As the bandits who owned this store appeared in full force on order, the leader of their gang immediately asked where he was hiding. While the boss was talking, Rick managed to jump out of the window, breaking the glass, and run wild. But this was quickly noticed. Max flew after him, with the spontaneity of a child, wondering why the owner was running away, and offered to plot a route. However, the robot made a mistake, and the guy found himself right in front of a dead end, with a wall more than 4 meters high, and the sound of his jaw hitting the asphalt was heard. Out of excessive feelings, he even hit the ghostly body of Max, who screamed that he had some good reason. But he didn't have time to tell what the reason was, because the guy had already been caught up by the bandits, who were clearly not used to such sprints. Demandingly extending his hand, the bandit, grinning, asked him if he wanted to live, and, without waiting for an answer from the frightened guy, demanded that he give up that thing. Max squeaked that there was a wooden sword next to the master, and asked to use it as a weapon. Still, having taken this stick, the guy even cried out in indignation at how he should fight with this. Suddenly, the stick in his hands glowed bright blue, causing the guy to look at it in surprise, as if he were holding a gun in his hands, no less. However, the bandits only laughed when they saw that he was really going to fight with this, and one of them immediately rushed at him with a bat. The next second, his face was crushed by the blow of this same stick, and the hearing-distorting sound of broken facial bones was heard. Amid the stunned cries of his teammates, he flew back from the guy, hitting the ground with a dull thud. But this had no effect. The rest of the gang with bats at the ready rushed to Rick, as soon as their boss ordered him to do this. But the guy was no longer afraid of them. His look became not just confident, but somehow crazy, because now he could use the skills he acquired in the labyrinth. It seemed like the boss only blinked before his entire gang was either unconscious or groaning in pain, and Rick was completely unharmed. The remaining guys, who did not have time to rush after them, backed away, not paying attention to their boss, listening to the guy who was threateningly approaching them. Only a moment passed, but all the defenders of the leader of the Black Mamba were lying on the ground, leaving him alone with a bat on the asphalt. Without any tactics, he simply began swinging the bat, backing away in horror. But this did not help against such an opponent. Having knocked the bat out of his hands, Rick did not allow him to pick it up, pressing his hand with the sharp end of the stick. Like a hunted animal, he tried to fight off the guy who was clearly provoking him, previously realizing that it was in vain. But rage clouded his eyes. But his blow did not reach the target. Rick swung his sword with force and hit the bandit in the face, instantly breaking the bones of his face. Blood gushed out from his broken nose and broken teeth. Before this man's eyes, everything clearly darkened and swam, and with his last breath he moaned, begging for mercy. But it seems this only provoked Rick, who was increasingly losing pity and compassion. With an absolutely happy, crazy smile, he raised the weapon again, putting all the hatred, rage, and resentment into this blow. He swung the stick, knocking even more blood out of his face. The sun came out on an unsightly-looking street, only highlighting this poverty, leaky roofs, shabby, dirty shacks, and garbage on the asphalt. In one of these houses, Rick lay on an old, dilapidated sofa and talked with Max, who did not understand why the master did not kill those bandits. It turned out that the robot also had a virtual hand in intimidating the leader of the Black Mamba, which the guy did not expect. Sighing heavily, the guy complained that now we need to hide Max more carefully so that no one finds out about him. Otherwise, it will change the whole idea of the game. Pulling out the knife for the umpteenth time that day, he became convinced that his skills worked even on him. Apparently, skills were learned intuitively. Hiding the knife in his pocket, he turned to the robot. But as if he knew that he was going to ask about the aging of the body, it turned out that the influence of the labyrinth was slowing him down. In a small, cheap, but decent cafe, two people were sitting, a decent-looking young man and some beaten-up gangster, with a black bag standing between them. Twirling the knife in his fingers, Rick asked how the bandit was lucky enough to come to a more or less capable state. He was clearly nervous, afraid to say something that might anger this guy, so he ingratiatingly agreed. But, of course, he thought differently. As soon as the guy was about to get up, the man already jumped up, standing at attention, having heard that the guy needed his help. This street was a little nicer than the one where Rick lived, but the high-rise buildings in need of major renovation were not encouraging. Leaning against the wall, the guy sat on the asphalt, pale and thin, like death, moaning that he needed more and more. The leader of the Black Mamba, with one kick, made him fly away from the iron doors into some garage. Continuing to fawn over Rick, the man answered all his questions as thoroughly as if he were answering them at school at the blackboard. Hearing the old man's voice, asking what kind of client had come to him, the guy didn't even think of being gentler in his intentions. A young guy in Chinese attire and several rows of beads greeted him with a friendly smile. A ghostly Max appeared nearby, warning him that the store owner's body was not human, and now he would catch the player's basic information. The guy who heard this grinned, noted that the model was expensive, but immediately moved on to the matter for which Rick came. Both guys turned to look at the man who was standing a little away guiltily when they started talking about the account, which turned out to be sold a long time ago. Pulling a black bag from behind his back, he moved on to the second issue that had brought him to this place, namely, trade. Looking into the bag, the guy could not hold back his surprised exclamation, which even made him freeze. Inside, shimmering with magical light, A dozen magic stones shone, bewitching with their appearance, but more striking with their presence and principle. The store owner, who sat down on the table, slyly took a closer look at the guy, asking if he knew about the true cost of the stones. Peering at the magic stones, the guy looked up playfully at the beaten man, still standing in the doorway and listening to their conversation. An attempt at resistance led to nothing, and he was quickly thrown out like a naughty dog. With his arms outstretched, the guy greeted Rick in a new way, as the main character of the sensational video. Unable to tear himself away from the stone of the Dark Knight of Chaos, he asked him what his real purpose was for visiting his store. Chuckling, Rick simply shrugged, not intending to deny it, but said that he was just coming to do some shopping like a normal person. The owner immediately changed his face when he heard that the guy had come for the mod, asking if he even understood what he was asking for. His face took on a strange expression, really not understanding why he needed a mod that the government had declared dangerous. Rick, who went to the window, stated that he, as a merchant, could not refuse him, but he cried out, unable to contain his emotions, asking if he had seen the dead man at the store. The guy looked at him, immediately remembering the man who really looked like a living corpse. The store owner remembered his desire to experiment with touch controls very well, so he bought the mod. But the result turned out to be very deplorable. Although the pain was dulled, but all his other senses were heightened to the limit, breaking him. The merchant looked in amazement at the guy who declared that he didn't care and was not against any means or methods. Poking his finger at the merchant's forehead, Rick asked him with a smile if he was interested in knowing what would happen next. He sighed resignedly, realizing that he would not be able to convince this guy, and pointing to the box with mod discs, adding that that was all. It contained only 6 discs, labeled with different numbers, but looking completely harmless. Rick carefully took the disc, allowing Max to scan it. This particular one increased the attack power 3 times. Pulling out all the discs one by one, he became more and more disappointed, because among them there was still nothing worthwhile. Taking the last disc without much hope for it, he scratched his head, asking the robot's opinion of it. And he was suddenly lucky, because this disc was created by a genius. The mod allowed him to influence events that could happen in favor of the player. Ignoring Max's cries about how this mod would increase the chance of random boxes falling out, Rick showed the merchant the 3 discs he was taking. He grinned, noting that he doubted him. But the guy's speech turned out to be not simple boasting, but he chose worthwhile fashions from a heap of garbage. Hearing about the garbage, Rick menacingly attacked the store owner, who immediately moved away, hiding behind some kind of test that he gives to the players. Mod windows immediately appeared in front of the guy, saying that installation was possible only once and could not be cancelled. Just as he was about to press the button to agree, the guy was interrupted by a merchant who cautiously asked what he would do with such power if he mastered the mod. Hearing the answer, his doll-like face burst into a fit of uncontrollable laughter, as if he had heard some kind of joke. However, Rick's answer was not funny at all. He was going to crush all the garbage that stands on top of the world. A small town with 36 half-timbered houses was surrounded by a stone wall with loopholes, which separated it from a lush green forest. Rick looked at his pass, which he had received without any of the problems he and Max had expected. The robot hummed nearby as usual. The guy looked around the village through which they were walking. Before that, not paying attention to anyone. Completely peaceful, filled with ordinary people displaying their food products at the market. The robot came again with his random boxes, literally demanding to spend points and tickets. Suddenly the guy jerked, noticing the looks that the locals were giving them. Hating, furious, they almost burned a hole in him. Max noticed them too, not understanding why people were so angry with the master for what he had already done. Rick didn't have time to answer, because they were both attracted by the thud of his body hitting the asphalt and the corresponding swearing. Some merchant grabbed the breasts of a guy who looked like a player and shouted how dare he steal his goods. The robot analyzed what game this guy was from, because his clothes were clearly not from here. It turned out that his labyrinth was closed about 3 months ago. There were plenty of people like him here, and they were unable to adapt to another world. Max was worried that their game might be completed, but Rick, grinning, replied that this time would be enough for him. The place chosen for the night looked standard, but compared to the conditions in which the guy lived, it was simply gorgeous. While the robot was checking the work of the mod on the orders of the master, he was happy that it actually worked. Smiling slyly, knowing how much Max had been waiting for this moment, he announced that now they would play random boxes. Rick's face looked more like a stone mask at this moment than a human face. This was not surprising when you look at the pile of garbage he received from this system. Slumping to his knees, barely restraining the frustration and despair exploding out, he looked through the list of things. Unable to bear the stupid teasing, Rick grabbed Max and began to shake him as hard as he could so that he would give something worthwhile. Suddenly, with a rainbow stroke, the box sparkled across the entire sky, like manna from heaven, descending towards them. Without ceasing to shake Max, the guy shouted in glee that he believed in both the mod and the robot combined. As many as 2 high-ranking boxes fell out onto the carpet, revealing 2 new skills, sprint and intuition. Rick looked at the intuition with a universal lack of understanding of what changed after receiving it. But as soon as we saw the significance of the number of points for strengthening it, indignation was added to these emotions. As Max hummed desperately, he put all the points into skills, seriously considering how to distribute them between skills. The robot whined like a petulant child who didn't get all the candy, but Rick ignored him indifferently. Smiling contentedly at the work done, he didn't even pay attention to his smoking companion on the bed. As soon as he increased the rank of his skill, a starry sky with a bright luminary in the middle spread out before the guy's eyes. Something like a stone egg, shining like the sun, blinded him, forcing him to cover his eyes with his hand. Rick's eyes lit up. As soon as he saw what came out of this egg, the skill rank increased significantly. The robot, lying on the bed, quietly muttered why he chose such a master for himself. But he could simply be happy about the falling out of different boxes. An expression appeared on Rick's face again, ready to cheer up even the moping Max, especially when he said that there was a case. A detachment of 5 people, led by some stern man with an axe, was preparing to depart. Rick walked past them without hiding. It was not surprising that they called out to him, asking where he was going alone. Without breaking his stride or turning around, he almost entered the portal, but everyone heard that he knew about the danger. The entrance to the cave looked as if it had been dug by a giant worm, and inside it was so dark that it would take your eye out. The senile, rattling voice giggled disgustingly, watching the guy in the magic ball, promising that he would not get out of there. In this stone medieval house, everything said that a witch lived here. Just take a pot-bellied cauldron on the fire. Sticking her long nails into the magic ball, the witch screamed shrilly, promising Riku the most painful death. Meanwhile, not everything was going smoothly for the guy. The darkness of the corridor caused significant inconvenience, so he had to move very slowly. Seeing the rating of the dungeon on the carefully opened screen, Rick cried out in surprise when he saw the completion time, a full 17 hours. Finally, he came to the first test. Large bats were sitting all over the walls and ceiling of the cave. Sensing the person, the creatures opened their red eyes and let out such a loud squeak that you wanted to cover your ears. But Rick knew how to defeat them with minimal effort and without much risk to his health. The sound bomb exploded almost at the same second when the guy managed to close his ears tightly. But the sound-sensitive mice were definitely not in trouble. As soon as it was over, He answered the surprised Max what it was, smiling contentedly at the result. And he was good. Every single creature fell to the ground, not having time to do anything, blood flowing from their ears. As he pierced each one with his sword, Rick was worried about why no one had yet survived this dungeon after Raphael had completed it. Chatting with the robot, they didn't even notice how they again came to the cave with mice, from which they had long since left. While Rick looked at all the details of the space in which they were stuck, he explained to Max that he had seen this dungeon 1,000 times already. The robot chattered that the master was probably just lost, but was embarrassed to ask for help. But finally, the corridor split into two. Looking at the stalagmite, Rick was convinced that this path was correct, while laughing at Max. Along the way, he explained how he understood and remembered the entire path to the next point, while the robot became more and more delighted. As soon as the guy left the labyrinth, his foot would have ended up over a trap cleverly set by the witch. The death energy should have taken him by surprise and finished him off. However, the witch's plan was not to come true, because the guy felt something was wrong. Taking the rag doll out of his inventory, he wondered whether it would work or not, but he had no choice. Black flames engulfed the body. The instant magic of death appeared here, so unexpectedly that Rick opened his mouth in shock. Scrolling through the screen with some data, he did not understand how it ended up here, but Max recommended that he leave. Once again, he looked around the space, hoping that he was on the wrong path, but only it was the right one. The witch's wrinkled lips parted in a smile, revealing terrible teeth, and she rasped that the guy was lucky, but he couldn't escape the magic of death. However, the next second she jumped up, staring at the ball in disbelief. The guy disappeared, but then he appeared again in his field of vision, right in the middle of all her traps. But then he took off, jumping across the field, as if avoiding all the deadly traps, like a sapper. The witch's eyes filled with rage when she saw that all her efforts had crumbled into dust, because this guy was the first to pass them. Before she had time to do anything, the wall behind her was torn apart by some powerful explosion, flooding the space with very bright light. Having quarreled with Max, Rick walked into the boss's room as if it were his own home, as if it was completely harmless. Pointing his sword at the witch, he smiled excitedly, wanting to finish off her as quickly as possible. The witch's lower limbs were mechanical iron legs like those of a spider. Smiling, he revealed to her the secret of passing all her traps. With the help of intuition, the guy calculated the gaps in space. Suddenly, the witch screamed like an alarm, and a sign appeared above her. Only for some reason, there were only question marks in the level column. Now she looked like death, especially with a huge amount of black magic in her hands. Jumping high above her with a sword in his hands, he activated all his skills, because delay was like death. All this sharpened his perception to the maximum, and the visual effect of blue, otherworldly flames enveloped the sword. The witch continued to speak, as if not expecting or afraid that the guy would harm her. But a rainbow stroke flashed right in front of her face. The boss's head flew away from his body with a deafening screech, without even having time to react. The body, left without its owner, sparkled with the magic of death, like a bomb, forcing the guy to jump away. Suddenly, something very strange began to happen. The witch's head darted towards the body, attaching energy to it. Her attacks became twice as strong. The guy barely had time to dodge the streams of death magic. Getting worse at dodging the attacks, Rick shouted to Max if he had any ideas. The monster evaluation mode showed all the data about the level and errors that the witch possessed, behind whose back wings were hidden. Seeing the cause of the bug, Rick rushed towards her wings through the black fire and activated the rating system again. Grinning, the guy clutched his weapon tighter, now perfectly understanding the source of the error. The witch did not waste time. Her attacks became more powerful again, streams of black flame poured out of her palms. But Rick was no longer afraid or doubtful. The desire to rise to the top moved him more and more, not paying attention to the robot. The huge ball of black flame that the witch held above her head hummed dangerously. But the guy wasn't looking at it. He managed to disappear right before the witch released this destructive wave of darkest magic and appeared right above her head. The old woman trembled all over, begging him not to do this, feeling the sharp tip of the sword rest between her wings. Rick tore off part of the wing with a crunch, accompanied by the piercing scream of the witch, not paying attention to her moans. Continuing to squeeze his wing, he activated his skill, fixing the bug. The alien breakdown evaporated, and the witch, who returned to her original state, recognized him. Without wasting any time or listening to her, Rick pierced the boss with his sword right where the heart was. She didn't even have time to scream before she collapsed on the floor. Her body crumbled into pixels, and the award sign immediately flashed in the air. Exhaling heavily, Rick weighed the magic stone in his hand, loudly indignant that the reward was small. The board players on the ground were still sitting in front of the dungeon, increasingly convinced of their loss. The long-haired boy, grinning, praised him that he lasted for 7 whole hours and even survived. While the others jeered after him, the squad leader froze in front of the sign that appeared, speechless. That guy was angry that Rick was completely oblivious to them, and he stopped him with his sword. He sighed, but turned around, telling him that there was a bug in the dungeon, which is why he set this record. But the long-haired one did not believe him, like the others, that such an unknown person as he had set a new world record. Clicking his tongue, Rick quickly moved a couple of meters and advised the guy to concentrate on conquering the corrected dungeon. However, for some reason he became even more angry, already seriously swinging his sword. But the guy managed to dodge, moving a couple of centimeters. The next second, the attacker fell, holding the middle of his chest, from which heavy wheezing escaped. But Rick was already at a sufficient distance. But the squad leader quickly brought him to his senses, pulling him towards himself. He shouted in his face that Rick did not take advantage of the bug, but corrected it. It was not for nothing that the Emerald Lake was called that. The reservoir itself was surrounded by huge mountains, covered with green trees, with a special shade of expensive stone. The fiery red forest formed a labyrinth that looked exactly like a spider, which is why it was called the Scarlet Spider Forest. On the floating islands stood the ancient ruins of the gods, half hidden in the misty clouds. Rick was having a snack on a stump in the middle of the forest, showing Max on the screen the next dungeons they should visit. Jumping to his feet, he became enthusiastic about erasing the name Raphael from all rankings. The squad, consisting of 6 elite players, had just dealt with the goblins. The setting sun illuminated the area with them. Raphael, as usual, hurried them to collect all the items from the enemies and declared that he wanted to go home as soon as possible. Suddenly, he turned to the screen, the image of which was the already dead boss of the Emerald Lake. His eyes narrowed in confusion. The situation was somehow strange. Why would it be? Next came a scarlet spider forest with a killed spider boss, green liquid pouring out of the huge cuts in its body. And the conclusion was the destroyed ruins of the gods, a stone golem covered with moss, lying in a confused heap. Raphael was lying on the sofa with his shoes on. A screen with videos was glowing in front of him, which he looked at with surprise and irritation. Smirking, he sat down, wondering out loud what Rick was up to. Was he really going to beat him like this? Suddenly, a guy burst into the dark room, shouting loudly. He called Raphael, who tutted at him indignantly. Regina, Lindsay's guild analyst, looked excitedly at the conference room screen, her eyebrows forming a thoughtful vertical crease. Being an analyst, not only out of interest, but also out of duty, she watched Rick's video, trying to unravel his secret. The guy was setting up the camera, For the first time, he was going to shoot a video on his own, without Max's help, and not in battle. Meanwhile, the robot was against the master filming this video, because it could cause a huge resonance in society. All the guild analysts gathered to watch the video. Even the head was present, managing to maintain his composure. The guy's face on the screen was very serious, but what he was saying was quite important. Some kind of truth that he was going to tell. Even people on the streets opened his video, wondering why some unknown person was able to get into the maze. Raphael chuckled contentedly as he read the angry comments wishing Rick dead. Suddenly, the guy looked straight into the camera, his gaze blazing with icy rage, and he turned directly to Raphael and the guild, promising that he would deal with them. In some three-dimensional space, like a hologram, the figure of a guy glowed in front of two red signs from which voices were heard. They discussed a video of an unknown Rick, who promised revenge on the guild, suggesting that they fired him. Lost in thought, the guy asked what they were going to do with these two, Rick and Raphael. Three unknown individuals unanimously decided that none of them was going to interfere in this matter, but would only observe. After the controversial guild video, Lindsay had to organize a conference where Raphael and Gabriel answered questions. They, naturally, asked very uncomfortable questions about the accusations that Lindsay made against Rick. Having launched a whole chain of tricky questions, the journalists, along with their voice recorders, stared at the director, who was supposed to comment on this somehow. A long-haired girl with flower clips in her hair carefully watched the broadcast from the conference. Rick appeared on the threshold of the shop in a black sweatshirt with the hood pulled down over his eyes. A girl of amazing beauty turned towards him. Only the voice that escaped from the depths of the doll's body was senile. Rick, noting that this voice did not suit the body, but interrupted himself, demanding new fashions from the merchant. However, he resisted, shrugging his shoulders, and said that those that Rick saw were the only ones. But he did not believe him, being indignant. Just hearing the guy's guess that the merchant knew the creator of the mod, the doll's eyes widened in surprise. But the guy didn't have to manipulate him. The owner of the shop took out the disc, which the creator handed over, promising a meeting with him if Rick mastered the mod. The guy snorted something about arrogance when he heard about it, but took the mod. Max immediately scanned it, reporting that this mod affects vision to obtain some information. Rick threw a bag of magic stones onto the floor, and immediately the joyful body of the shop owner rushed towards him. She and Max walked along the evening streets of the city, filled with ordinary people, talking about plans. Another meeting was scheduled for that day. Suddenly, Rick was called out by the friendly voice of some handsome guy walking straight towards him with his palm raised in greeting. He came closer, closing the distance, grabbing the guy by the shoulder, asking how he was doing, as if he were a good old friend. As for the old thing, it was indeed true. They had known each other for a long time, since school. Very embarrassed, Harry smiled nervously, asking for a minute to talk. Putting his arm around Rick's shoulder, he directed him somewhere, immediately relaxed, and began to babble that he was sorry, and that what happened 3 years ago was terrible. Following them, merging with the surroundings, followed people with pistols and black suits, constantly keeping them under surveillance. Harry sat down at the table, starting the conversation again with words about what happened 3 years ago, as if it was hard for him to talk. His blue gaze under his glasses tensed when he heard that Rick didn't need such apologies. He needed proof of his sincerity. His voice became quiet and conspiratorial when he spoke about his plan for the guy to become bronze again, even though it would be difficult. But Rick heard him with half an ear, stirring up old memories of how Harry looked at him through his glasses 3 years ago. Not paying attention to the rain, the guy desperately begged him for help, because there was only a week left before his mother's operation. He even fell at his feet, begging him to pay for it, and he would return everything. But Harry only kicked him forcefully in the stomach. Stretched out on the asphalt in pain, Rick stared into space in disbelief. His friend wished him death. His mother died, but standing in front of her body, he could not believe what had happened, stupidly staring at the body under the sheet. Looking down, Rick just grinned. He knew very well that the world in the labyrinth of their game was destroyed, which means Harry was spinning like a snake. Suddenly, he shouted that he could sell information about Lindsay, and as a sign of good intentions, he said that Gabriel was Raphael's brother. Rick involuntarily turned around, because he really didn't know this. Harry continued to hand him the card, clearly very nervous, saying that he just wanted to discuss the plan. However, Rick was nearby in an instant, squeezing the black piece of paper so tightly that it shattered into pieces under the amazed gaze. Harry's face twisted with rage when he said irritably that he had groveled in front of him in vain, pulling out a knife. However, he did not have time to do anything. Rick, burning with dull rage, grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground, and he pushed him away with force, launching him straight into the tables and chairs, which he knocked down with his back. While Harry cleared his throat, bringing his breathing back to normal, Rick headed out without looking back. However, there were guys waiting for him with pistols at the ready, and he had a feeling of déjà vu. With inhuman speed, Rick knocked one of them down, throwing him onto his back like a bug. The others didn't even have time to react. When they came to their senses and rushed after him, the guy who jumped onto the roof was already gone. Watching him and Max from above, he began to think, because Gabriel was very serious. It was clear. Straightening up to his full height, he stood up, answering the robot's question that he knew what to do next. Gabriel sat on the chair, but still looked down at the guy in front of him. His whole appearance radiated displeasure. Narrowing his eyes, he hovered over him, asking if he really thought that the Lindsays did not know basic information about their employee. They were interested in something else. Harry cried, throwing up his head, that he would find out everything if only he was given a second chance. But he was unperturbed. Gabriel stood up and headed out, suddenly turning around and slowly saying that he wouldn't give a chance to a piece of shit who was ready to sell out his friends. The guy's mouth opened slightly, and in a trembling voice he asked in disbelief what he called him, as if all the color had drained from his face. Pulling out a knife, the guy rushed at him, yelling that he shouldn't dare look down on him. However, Gabriel, grabbing his head with one hand, pressed it into the floor with a crunch so that blood sprayed out of it. In a calm voice, he said that the attack of bronze on gold would result in the death penalty, but he would have mercy. The two boys grabbed him by the elbows as Harry begged him not to be demoted to unknown. But Harry couldn't hear him anymore. Gabriel wondered who had molded a good analyst into a special person, a player the whole world was watching. His eyes glowed with a grim determination to find out what secret this unknown person was hiding and to destroy him. A bright white lightning bolt of movement struck right into the center of a medieval village in a labyrinth. In fact, it was a teleportation stone, with the help of which Rick moved from a new journey. Having reached the place he needed, he pulled the helmet off his head, not paying attention to the cooing Max. People immediately seemed to notice him, shamelessly pointing their fingers at him and starting to whisper. Rick, meanwhile, did not pay attention to them, opening a page with a system for receiving random boxes. Nothing worthwhile came out of the first 10 boxes, but Rick didn't sigh sadly, as usual. The guy allowed a pleased Max to use all the tickets he had accumulated, to the sound of his approving buzz. However, he continued to have no luck. But in the square, there was a whole mountain of useless things. Rick even fell to his knees. Having pulled out 5 legendary tickets, the player looked at them lovingly, glancing sideways at the robot, as if waiting for his cue. From the first golden box floated a fiery phoenix feather on a chain. Rick looked at it thoughtfully, nodding contentedly at the possibility of one revival it offered. The item did not appear from the next box right away, so the guy rubbed his hands, already anticipating something useful. With an unreadable expression on his face, he clutched an electric toothbrush, while the robot laughed mechanically. A nervous laugh escaped his mouth as he examined the brush for any hidden functions. Rick threw it at the sarcastic robot, screaming for him to take his trash. The next 3 boxes cut the sky with a bright yellow light. Undoubtedly, the dropped swords were amazing luck, but it was a little unusual. As many as 3 swords were repeated. A crowd of players and ordinary people who populated the game surrounded the guy they knew, who was again kneeling, with a robot flying next to him. Having flown away a considerable distance, Max delighted Rick that he now had access to the synthesis function for repeating objects. Suddenly, the robot cooed again, which is how he likes it so much when his owner suffers a fiasco in his system. But the guy was completely immersed in the new function, deciding to deal with this weirdo later. After a couple of clicks, an updated sword pistol fell into his hands, only now golden, delighting the player. Having carried out a couple of transformations, he only had time to praise the transformed weapon. Rick, who was about to experiment with his skills, was unpleasantly surprised by the random loss of a power-up, blaming the robot for it. Considering the new opportunity, he wondered if he had lost, because he seemed somehow normal. Suddenly, a man fell on the guy from behind, about to strike him, while he pretended not to notice him. His sword was next to Rick's throat in the next second, along with a question about his identity. However, the guy did not have time to finish his answer, as the sword cut the skin on his neck, causing him to widen his eyes in surprise. The attacker stood opposite him, pointing his sword, declaring that here, of course, he would not die, but the pain would be severe. The next moment, the man was behind him, again piercing him through the chest area. Rick fell onto the flagstones of the courtyard, still laughing and flinching, as the attacker promised that they would pursue him. Turning his bloodied face towards him, he said that what was happening in the game, which was Lindsay's property, was not surprising to him. Taking on a menacing appearance, the mercenary pointed his sword at him, promising to turn his laughter into a scream. Rick also found himself in a stance, smiling, further inciting and angering his opponent. He swung his sword forcefully, delivering his first blow, announcing that it was now his turn. The crowd froze in amazement and fear. For the first time, a sword fight with blood took place between the players. Rick's sword sharply pierced him through, pinning him to the paving stones on the landing, and knocked out a groan from him, begging for mercy. However, the guy only grinned and pressed harder, asking where all the pathos with which he attacked had gone. His eyes suddenly became frighteningly bloodthirsty as he spoke of the terrible pain from the endless torture. Out of nowhere, several more people appeared in black impenetrable masks, coming to the aid of their comrade. One of them, apparently the main one, demanded that Rick log out of the system and end his playing career, and they will make some concessions. However, he, grinning, asked what kind of concessions were being discussed if they attacked him first, although he was silent. Another sword pierced into the enemy's flesh brought him a new portion of terrible pain, from which he howled. Looking directly into his eyes, Rick answered the question asked earlier about the origin of this sword, which should not have been there. But he only pulled his mask tighter, showing with all his appearance how uninterested he was. But then he pulled himself together and said that his path would end here. As if on orders, the entire squad of mercenaries, except 2, rushed at Rick, swords drawn as he stood looking into the eyes of their leader. But he abruptly went down and to the side, avoiding all the blades that flashed very close. But suddenly the commander appeared from the side. The guy thought that he was really very fast. Even before he had time to strike, Rick was faster, with one swing of his sword moving behind him, striking him. He also saw the next attacker perfectly. Despite the fear from the active aura, he fulfilled his duty to the customer. Rick turned around, parrying his blow. Sparks flew from the swords in all directions. Even the air trembled. However, Rick was stronger due to his skills and forcefully slashed the mercenary's stomach with a sword, the blade of which trailed a bright red trail. The others froze, shocked by the newcomer's skills, like skill and talent rolled into one. But the guy wasted no time. His sword was already rushing towards one of the enemies who did not have time to react. The crowd screamed in horror. From the scream that escaped from the throat of the wounded enemy, it was so heartbreaking. A weapon glowing with magical light appeared in the hands of the remaining members of the squad, and they themselves gathered together more closely. Chuckling, Rick noticed the famous weapons, asking if they were going into hiding, especially the one with the nickname of the double sword, Casper. He, in turn, cast some very powerful spell that required energy and concentration. At that same second, a drawing appeared under Rick, from which golden chains of illusions jumped out, wrapping around his arms and legs. 3 attacks of different elements of fire, ice, and lightning, as if wild animals rushed towards the guy to trample and destroy him. However, the attack missed. The updated sword saved him from the attack, not allowing him to inflict a single scratch. The detachment commander's face took on some kind of upset expression, at the same time doomed. A bullet made a hole in his chest. He fell with a crash onto the stone of the platform, looking ahead with hatred, but clutching his sword in his hand, as if he could still get up. His squad mates backed away, not understanding how such a weapon could appear in this game. That was what was scary. This feature of the pistol and the sword was useless against most of the monsters in this game, but it worked perfectly against people. Rick held his sword in front of him, asking with a crazy smile why they were so afraid, because they should be held responsible for the attack. Several loud shots rang out in a row, while the guy grinned. He liked to feel superior. The entire squad was lying on the square, howling in pain, unable to get away from it anywhere. Max even felt sorry for them, because their exit was blocked. Rick knelt down on one knee, looking around at Casper, who had his face buried in the stone. A sudden flash of some light and a hail of lightning made the guy jump sharply to the side, flying parallel to the ground. He knew this skill very well, having seen it thousands of times on video. It was one of the rare long-range skills. A hail of star stones poured from the sky, spreading a rainbow glow. It was a real meteor shower. They crushed the paving stones with a roar, forcing the guy to dodge faster, because one of them could kill. As soon as possible, he summoned a metastatic stone that would transport him from here. With his departure, the attack abruptly stopped, leaving behind a broken space and frightened inhabitants. Rick managed to run away from the place where a human figure appeared from the smoke and dust, easily twirling the spear in his fingers. A grinning Raphael emerged from the teleportation flash. Rick's face changed. For the first time in this time, he felt real fear, because he had imagined this moment many times. In a trembling voice, he asked if Raphael remembered him, but he just looked at him like he was a bug, saying that he didn't remember. A pitiful expression appeared on Rick's face, which made the ace Lindsay laugh out loud. Preparing to attack, Raphael pointed his spear at him, and his entire figure was engulfed in a golden glow, and asked not to disappoint him. The guy, in turn, prepared his sword, and his face took on a predatory expression, simultaneously appearing with a red aura. Raphael attacked first, aiming his spear at his face, moving at breakneck speed. A huge stream of golden energy rushed forward, destroying everything in its path. A huge trench several tens of meters long passed, exactly a few centimeters from the man who managed to dodge. The next second, the spear collided with the sword, forcing Rick to turn all his reflex skills to maximum. He had to instinctively jump away because Raphael swung his spear sharply. The guy was breathing heavily because he could not use his most important parry skill due to the fact that the enemy's speed was too high. The blonde's face distorted into a gambling, angry grimace, telling Riku that for him this fight was mere entertainment, because his opponent was weak. He rushed towards him like an arrow, putting out his spear, almost reaching his face, asking what he was hiding. Jumping high into the air, he raised the weapon, already glowing with a purple light, swinging at Rick, and hitting it with such force that the ground began to crack. Soaring into the air, a monstrous roar was heard. The guy's hand felt like his wrist was broken. But that wasn't the most important thing. What was important was that Rick was able to block. He sharply pulled the sword towards himself, causing Raphael to grit his teeth and be indignant. However, the advantage did not last long. The blonde was not in vain considered an ace, attacking him with force, even from an awkward position. Rick covered himself with his smoking sword, frozen in horror, realizing that his opponent's attacks were stronger than those of the Dark Knight. Raphael noticed that his opponent uses parry, although such a skill is not in this game, laughing at it. And he jumped on him again, attacking with the same enthusiasm and strength as at the beginning, without slowing down the onslaught. The spear and sword vibrated from the collision. The first weapon behaved in some unusual way, again alarming the guy. This star spear was undoubtedly unique. The more it attacked, the greater its speed. Riku could only dodge. That's when his limit was found. Raphael's spear pierced him through the stomach, and he jerked the weapon, shaking it off with a careless movement. The pain was terrible even from the first wound, so Rick did not feel his back hitting the ground painfully as he flew. Grinning at his opponent's question, the guy replied that it would be better for him to ask Cynthia if this is the same force supporting him behind the scenes. Raphael immediately changed his face, becoming excited, and grabbed Rick by the collar, almost shouting if he knew where this girl was. And the guy activated a small blinding bomb without even allowing his opponent to finish the question. He jumped back, very surprised by such useful garbage, as he immediately told Rick. The guy's eyes glowed red again, the color of the energy that enveloped the sword itself, with which he prepared to attack. Standing in front of him, he stated that up to this point, he had not fought even 50%. Max understood what the master was talking about, so he asked him not to feel sorry for him later. Fully confident that he was bluffing and just showing off, Raphael attacked him again with his spear with the same speed. However, while focusing on his strategy, Rick did not notice that his opponent was not above using more than just weapons. With one blow of his knee, he sent his opponent flying straight into the stone, instantly switching from defense. Blood gushed from the smeared internal organs from the guy's mouth, and his eyes almost fell out of their sockets from the pain. At the last second, he saved himself from being impaled on the spear by grabbing it with his hand, deflecting it from its course. However, it still pierced his shoulder, causing Rick to grit his teeth in pain. It felt like it was going to tear off. Raphael rubbed his neck, as if he was very tired, noting with a heavy sigh that this place for a fight was the best, quietest. However, Rick was no longer fooled by his chatter. In the blink of an eye, he moved behind his opponent. Raphael was not so easy to fool, so he was able to carry out an attack, hitting the guy with force. The next second, a new purple explosion was heard, consuming the entire figure of Rick, who did not have time to return. Again, he did not suddenly lose consciousness from pain, but blood sprayed from his mouth as soon as some of the dust settled. But despite all this monstrous pain, he, leaning on his sword, slowly stood up, staring into emptiness with a hateful gaze. His opponent just didn't yawn. He was so bored of making a chop out of a player of unknown rank. Grabbing him by the clothes, Raphael forcefully sent the guy high into the sky, laughing uproariously. In conclusion, he activated his legendary skill of meteor shower, gushing out in terrible torrents. Ace Lindsay smiled with satisfaction, hitting the ground with his spear when he heard a monstrous roar. The screen with the letter swung open in front of the guy, showing a message from his brother, who demanded his urgent presence. Just as he was about to leave, he was stopped by a loud, furious cry. But the speaker's voice trembled greatly. He again, leaning on the sword, tried to rise from his knees, but the unbearable pain throughout his body greatly hindered him. Max, who appeared out of nowhere, said that he would now turn off all the new sensitivity control settings, noting that the owner was a masochist for deciding to experience this pain. Raphael reluctantly approached the guy who was still trying to get up, recommending not to do this. But Rick asked him if he was afraid of his brother. Pressing his hand to his crushed chest, seeing his interlocutor's shock, he continued to taunt him, calling him a pawn. Grabbing some kind of rusty blade from the ground, Rick slashed Raphael, who was not expecting such a thing, in the neck. He instantly grabbed the wound, from which blood spurted out, staining his clothes. This angered the ace Lindsay seriously, immediately activating some of his techniques at the tip of the spear. However, Rick knocked down the entire concentration of energy with one blow of his sword pistol, causing an irritated look from his opponent. Jumping high, he aimed at the blonde's knee, piercing it with force with the blade, releasing a whole stream of blood. Raphael bent over in pain, realizing that he needed to end this fight as quickly as possible, which had turned against him. As many as 4 skills swirled around the spear, which was already engulfed in yellow flames. This was one of his strongest techniques. A moment later, Rick slid away from the rather painful skill like a black shadow. But his opponent quickly noticed this. Suddenly, all sorts of debris flew at Raphael, which, although not much, still interfered and irritated him, and was supposed to reduce the damage. But the enraged ace overtook his opponent, touching his back with a luminous spear. Rick collapsed, as if he had lost consciousness, while Raphael still continued to point his spear at him, breathing heavily. When he was about to deliver the final, decisive blow, the guy suddenly stopped the spear with both hands, a few centimeters from his chest. The blonde screamed in fear when something strange began to happen to his spear. He was engulfed in a bluish light. The spear finally disintegrated into pixels, completely disappearing from the hands of both players.